All right, I have with me today Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and Marine. Today, we're going to be talking about the Russia-Ukraine war. We're going to be talking about China inserting themselves in diplomacy. We're going to be talking about the CIA and several other topics. Scott, thank you so much for being on today's show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I'm going to put your website down below, scottritterextra.com. I'll also put my newsletter and also this month's cash giveaway that my wife and I are doing. But I want to jump right into this. You probably know about this, but new leaked documents this week coming out of Ukraine show Ukraine's generals had planned a middle of the night attack on Moscow to seek revenge on Russia on the 1-year anniversary of them invading Ukraine. It took, from what I'm reading, it took several people at the CIA, the State Department, and possibly even the White House going back and forth trying to convince them that this is going to end in nuclear retaliation or World War III. Were you aware of this attack? And what do you think would have been the outcome if Ukraine had launched this attack on Moscow unbeknownst to NATO?
Well, I wasn't aware of the specifics of the attack until the information came out. I can say that monitoring a variety of Ukrainian Telegram channels and things of that nature, that there had been talk about something like this. And I think it's important for people understand for people listening to understand that while we talk about a war in Ukraine, this isn't a war. If it was a war, this conflict would be over already. Russia's not at war with Ukraine. Russia is seeking a solution that keeps Ukraine from becoming NATO. War means the destruction of a nation. War means the total defeat of a people. And so I think what the United States and those who intervened were trying to tell the Ukrainians is, if you attack Moscow, there's going to be a war, and all of you are going to die. I just want to point that fact out. If this was a war, Zelensky would not be alive today. He would have been killed in week 1, week 2. If this was a war, Kiev would not exist as it currently exists, with a functioning government, infrastructure, things of that nature. Just ask the Iraqis what happened when we went to war against them. The first places we bombed were presidential palaces, parliament, the functions of government. Leaders became a command and control target, and we hunted them down. Saddam Hussein lived because every day he moved between different targets, different places. We were one step behind him. But I could personally attest, we were trying to kill him. I tried to kill him. One of my missions during the war was to kill Saddam. The Russians are not trying to kill Zelensky. They're letting him live. They're letting the Ukrainian government function because their goal is not the destruction of Ukraine. If the Ukrainians carried out this attack, and look, there's others that they're talking about. Right now, they're talking about sending drones to attack the Victory Day parade on March 9th. If they do this, they will die, literally, because Russia's not at war. But if you attack Moscow in the middle of the night, on the first year anniversary, or on May 9th during the Victory Day parade, that is an act of war, and Russia will respond in the same. They may not use nuclear weapons. In fact, they won't use nuclear weapons against Kiev, but they will take Kiev off the grid. It will no longer exist. And then NATO may get involved, and now we have a nuclear war. So I think that's why the United States came in and did what they did, because the United States, with all the rhetoric that we have here, we understand that Russia is not putting everything on the line here, that this is still very much a limited military operation for Russia, that Russia's goal and objective is not the destruction of the Ukrainian state. If it was, this war would be over. The other problem for the United States is how do you build up a country like we did with Ukraine, elevate Zelensky to be the modern day version of Winston Churchill? I will fight them on the beaches, I will fight them in the shores, I will fight them, and then tell them, well, you can't.
Yeah.
We're going to pretend you're Winston Churchill, but you can't be Winston Churchill, because if you do that, you're going to die. And now Zelensky's looking reality in the face. Ukraine has lost the war, and everybody knows it. And so Zelensky's desperate for something that can change the algorithm, change the equation. And I think there's a lot of people surrounding him say that the best way we can survive is to bring NATO into the conflict. And the easiest way to bring NATO into conflict is to go to war against Russia. So, okay. Yeah, but I think I'll leave it with this. Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president, gave a speech yesterday. And I hope every American watches that speech, because there's a lot of talk in the United States about the Russians bluffing. You hear it on the media all the time. Oh, Russia's bluffing about nuclear weapons. They're shaking the nuclear saber, but they're never going to do it. Russia would never do that. And Medvedev said straight up, he said, look, I'm a former president. I will tell you right now that Russia is a nuclear armed nation, and the Russian president, and I was this way, must have a steady hand over the nuclear button, willing to push it at any time that it is required to be pushed. And he said, our doctrine clearly states that if somebody carries out operations that represent an existential threat to Russia, we will use nuclear weapons. And you need to understand there will be no hesitancy, no warning, no discussion, no debate. We will use them. So anybody who sits there and says, well, let Ukraine do this, why not? It's a suicide pill. And remember, when Russia uses nuclear weapons, it begins what will always end up as a general nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia, and we will all die. So that's why the United States intervenes so hard, because I don't think anybody in the United States in a position of power wants to swallow the Ukrainian suicide pill. And that's what allowed Ukraine to attack Moscow would become.
Okay. Oh, man, interesting. I don't in any way want to defend Putin with what I'm going to say next, but just my observation and my logic seems like he is the more steady hand than Medvedev. I don't speak Russian, but
Medvedev, yeah.
Is Putin good cop and Medvedev the bad cop, or is he just a little bit more wild in his thinking and comments than Putin? Because he's the one that's always like threatening, nuclear war, and Putin's like, okay, hold on, we're just going to keep going with the Russian doctrine.
Look, Medvedev, when he was president, was a very reasonable man. And the reason is, I think the position defines the man. And to be president of Russia is to be president of a world power with tremendous responsibilities. And Putin is a very steady, stable player. Medvedev has a different job today. And see, Medvedev can say things that Putin can't, because it's one thing to have the actual president say something. It's another thing to have somebody on the sideline say something. Medvedev, of course, is very influential. He sits on the National Security Council. He's a close advisor of Vladimir Putin. And so when he speaks from a position of authority, but not the ultimate authority. Gotcha. And so I think Medvedev's job right now, and I think he's relishing this job, is to be that crazy dog in the background, that crazy, snarling, foaming, rabid dog. And Putin's the guy holding the dog by the chain, saying, I don't want to let him go. I really don't want to let him go. Don't make me let him go. So that's his job. But I think if, for instance, Medvedev ever again became president, he would revert to more of a Putin style, because it's the job dictates the attitude, and no president would ever behave that way. It's irresponsible. Medvedev is far removed from the nuclear button, therefore he can make these talks. But remember, he is somebody who was president, and he is not going to be saying these things unless he has a green light from the Kremlin. So I think the Russian president enjoys him saying this, because it scares the living you-know-what out of people.
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, even just within the last week, President Lukashenko of Belarus said, everybody should still be very worried about nuclear war. Um, like this conflict is not behind any of us. And I didn't know if he was maybe posturing on behalf of Putin since they're buddies, or if he's pointing out a truth that this is still something that could very much go sideways. One mistake, an attack in the middle of the night that NATO doesn't have control over, and next thing you know, we're launching, missiles at each other. Is he backing Putin, or is he telling the truth?
Both. It's both. Look, I think a lot of Americans, I mean, I had a conference in my paying job the other day, and I made the reference to the term special military operation, and immediately somebody jumped in and said, "Well, I don't speak Putin," meaning that simply by using the term special military operation, I was somehow buying into a Russian lexicon and therefore supporting Russian propaganda. And I said, well, that's about the most ignorant thing I've ever heard anybody say, because I'm not speaking Putin either. I'm speaking reality. This was a special military operation, the initial goals and objectives of which were to get Ukraine to the negotiating table, to bring a rapid conclusion to a problem between Ukraine and Russia. And it almost worked. On April 1st, Ukraine was supposed to sit down in Istanbul and sign a peace treaty with Russia, but NATO intervened. And that intervention is everything, because prior to that, this was simply a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And that is not an existential threat to Russia. But when NATO intervenes and turns Ukraine into a proxy of NATO to achieve the strategic defeat of Russia, we have now created an potential existential crisis for Russia. And as Medvedev said, an existential crisis means we use nuclear weapons to defend ourselves. And that's the state we've been in since May, June of 2022. We have been facing the imminent possibility of a nuclear war, because this war is between NATO and Russia. And that's what Lukashenko is saying. He's saying, even though if you're looking at things, it looks like everything's going okay for Russia right now, what happens if Poland intervenes in Western Ukraine? What happens if Latvia and Lithuania decide to embargo Kaliningrad, that Russian enclave on the Baltic Seas? These are acts of war that could get Russia engaged in military conflict with a NATO member. Article 5 then kicks in, and now it's a general war between Russia and NATO, not a de facto war, but a real war, and nuclear weapons will be used. So that's what Lukashenko is saying. He's saying, for all those people in Poland that are meeting with the Ukrainians, talking about erasing the border to create a confederation between Ukraine and Poland, thereby allowing Poland to bring troops in, that will be a nuclear conflict. For all those people in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia who think you can embargo Kaliningrad to punish Russia, that will be a nuclear conflict. That the threat of nuclear war is very real. Remember, he's the president of Belarus, who has now been empowered by Russia. On July, Russia will be storing nuclear weapons on Belarus soil that are going to be turned over to Belarus Air Force and missile forces in case of a war. So Lukashenko is speaking as a potential nuclear leader. So everybody should listen to what he's saying. He's not threatening anybody. He's just stating a straight up fact that things can still go, as you said, sideways. And if they go sideways, nuclear weapons are very much on the table. So I say this not because I want to fearmonger or be seen as supporting Russian policy. I say this as an American who doesn't want to die. And I would hope that everybody listening to this understands that that's what we're talking about. This isn't a game. This is reality. And for Russia, it's life and death reality, just as if a Russian army was in Mexico threatening to empower insurgents in America to strip away Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Maybe even take Colorado and Utah while you're at it. Just carve away all of those former Spanish territories, former Mexican territories, and bring them in. We would view that as an existential threat, and we would use every weapon necessary to prevent that from happening, to include nuclear weapons. That's where Russia is right now, and they're not playing games.
Yeah. I bring this stuff up because I read this but then I go to like CNN and MSNBC and ABC News. They're not talking about the warnings from Lukashenko. They're not talking about the warnings from Medvedev. And that's why I bring these up. And sometimes people are like, well, you're making this stuff up because I'm not seeing it in the mainstream media. But
Yeah.
trusting the mainstream media is typically not the best thing to do. So I appreciate your insight on that,
Did you
Colonel.
see did you
Oh,
see
go ahead.
Tucker Carlson's most recent interview after he left Fox?
Possibly. I've watched several things trying to understand, but tell me what it is, and then I'll tell you if I know what you're
Well, it was
saying.
just he was doing a podcast. It was a young kid. I think he referred to his age as
Oh,
28.
okay.
But the interesting thing, the only reason I bring it up is that he said one of the greatest insights is he said, is that the media is not here to tell you the truth. The media is here to shape things. They lie, they distort, and so the reason why I brought that up is to reinforce what you were saying. When you watch CNN, when you watch MSNBC, when you watch Fox News, when you watch anything, ABC, NBC, CBS, understand they're not there to tell you the truth. They are there to shape a perception. They are there to promulgate a a policy position that's not about the truth, but about what we want you to do. Um, and so it it's very likely when you look at something as controversial as Ukraine that you're not going to get the truth from mainstream media. And this is why it's important to dig deeper. And that's why I hope people are grateful for what you're doing, because you are providing them with analysis and information that they wouldn't be getting from mainstream media, but they should be getting from mainstream media.
Yeah. Okay. Now that you explain it, I did see that. I didn't personally watch Tucker Carlson on Fox News, but with him being fired, I've been digging into him a little
Yeah.
bit more, and yeah, he said that he was kind of embarrassed to be in his 50s and it hadn't dawned on him that he was part of the government mouthpiece, putting out narrative versus putting out truth. I thought that was pretty a sign of humility to recognize that. And some of that is, your sponsors dictate what you're able to talk about. We
Absolutely.
saw that during COVID. We see that during wartime situations. Okay. Colonel Douglas McGregor has said that this war has moved from a special operation to a humanitarian crisis, and that the American people don't fully understand how awful this war is every day. The trenches, this is as bad as World War I and World War II. The Ukrainian people are being slaughtered, and we don't, we're mad that our tax money is going to them versus helping the homeless or whatever. But their reality is that they are being wiped out as a nation. What are your thoughts on him saying that this has now become a humanitarian crisis for Ukraine?
Well, I mean, again, I'll preface this by saying that Colonel McGregor is one of the few sane voices out there. And every time he speaks, there's that old commercial when I forget the name of the company, but when so and so speaks, everybody listens. When Colonel McGregor speaks, everybody should listen, because he is very, very balanced. And I have to second to what he's saying. I mean, um, it is a humanitarian. We're watching the death of a nation, literally the death of a nation. But more than that, we're watching the the death of a people. I don't mean individuals. I mean the Ukrainian people. If the casualty figures are remotely correct, and I believe they are, over 300,000 Ukrainian men have died. Right? That's a genetic pool that is gone, removed. I don't want to get into too much, but understand that you know we all know where we came from, and it wasn't storks. Okay, and it requires a man and a woman in union to produce children. And the Ukrainians are losing their men; they're being slaughtered. Um, and again, I don't want to get into too much Darwinism here, but some of the best examples of Ukrainian men, the most healthy, most physically fit, um, you know, manly men, are dying. And so what's left is not that. What's left is something different. which is going to change the way Ukraine moves forward as a nation. This is wrong. This is just we and most Americans don't get it. They're being slaughtered. It's not a fair fight. No, no war is meant to be. Colin Powell famously said, "I don't believe in a fair fight. My job isn't to have a fair fight. My job is to kill you." Um, and that's what the Russians are doing right now. They have, over the course of the last several months, changed the entire dynamic of this war zone. Ukrainian air defense almost doesn't exist anymore. And by removing air defense on the front line, the Russian Air Force is now freer to attack targets using weapons they previously couldn't do. Ukrainian weapons that were given to them by the United States designed to equalize the battlefield no longer work because the Russians are very smart, very adaptive. They've jammed the GPS signals. And so the Ukrainians aren't able to do to the Russians what the Russians are doing to them in increasing numbers. And the Russians are gradually getting angry. And what I mean by that is their capacity to kill is becoming greater. Whereas during the Battle of Mariupol, the Russians did not habitually drop entire apartment buildings. They would actually send their troops in who would fight floor by floor by floor to take the building, very bloody fighting. And then they'd give the people in the basement a chance to surrender. Now the Russians come forward, and if the Ukrainians have turned an apartment block into a fortified zone, they pull back and they drop a 1,500-pound bomb on it and drop the whole building, killing everybody inside. They're doing that over and over again. The Ukrainians used to be able to assemble troops about 15 kilometers behind the front line, concentrate them before sending them in to fight as a coherent force. Now, as they assemble them, the Russians are detecting it, and they're dropping the 1,500-pound bomb right on those troops, killing everybody. The Ukrainians can't concentrate their forces. Their artillery is being destroyed piecemeal by drones that are operating freely without any interference. And the Ukrainians are running out of artillery ammunition, so they can't even defend their troops in the trenches. And trench warfare is hell, excuse my language. It is a living hell. This war, I mean, war is, again, Tecumseh Sherman said it, war is hell. I forget there was another general that said, thank goodness the war is so bad as it is because we grow to love it. Yeah, maybe Ulysses Grant said that, but this is all true. We know this, but this is a special kind of hell. This is Dante's Inferno 20 times over for the Ukrainian soldiers. And to be blunt, we're to blame. The American people are to blame because we have allowed our government to create this situation. This war is happening because of American policies, only because of American policies. And we have poured so much money and so much material into this war. We've kept it going longer than it naturally should have. This war should have been over a long time ago. Ukraine was never going to win this war. Russia was always going to win this war. What we've done is prolonged this conflict, ensuring that hundreds of thousands of more Ukrainians die, tens of millions of Ukrainians are displaced, homes are destroyed, cities are destroyed, towns are destroyed. And all the while, we're balancing on the precipice of a nuclear conflict that could put us at risk as well. But McGregor is 100% correct. This is a humanitarian disaster, and the best thing we could do is bring an end to it. And the easiest way to end this war is to cut off the supplies to Ukraine and force them to go to the negotiating table. They're on life support right now, and all we're doing is pumping artificially, stimulated life to a body that shouldn't be alive. We need to unplug it, get it done, and let Ukraine move on and try and recover as much as they can.
Do you think Volodymyr Zelensky had NATO's permission to reach out to China to try to broker peace, or is he seeing the writing on the wall and he's like, NATO's just going to keep encouraging us to fight and send weapons. We need to end this. We've got to turn to China. Where do you think this phone call came from? Permission, no permission, desperation?
Well, first of all, you can't pick up a phone and call somebody if they haven't given you the number. So I think, we have to start with the fact that what we're seeing here isn't Ukrainian diplomacy, it's Chinese diplomacy. And I think we both know Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, a very good man. And Ray has repeatedly lambasted the fact that where is American diplomacy? I mean, why isn't Zelensky calling Washington, D.C. to bring an end to this war? Because we're not in the business of ending the war. China is suddenly, apparently discovered the secret diplomatic, sauce. They went into the Middle East and they did something that nobody even thought about, which was to bring Saudi Arabia and Iran together and create peace. China's working with Russia to bring the Saudis to Syria and bring an end to that conflict. Peace is breaking out all over and has a Chinese accent to it. And so China now has come in. They had, Xi Jinping flew to Moscow, had that 3-day meeting with Vladimir Putin. And before that, they put out a 12-point peace plan. And everybody's like, well, that's not going to work. That's not the point. Diplomacy is never solved by the first piece of paper put on the table. Anybody who's ever been involved in a negotiation understands that that's simply a starting point that begins a dialogue that ends with something that is achievable. So the Chinese put something on the table that nobody else was. Where was the American 12-point plan? Where's the European 12-point plan? They don't exist. China put it on the table and forced people to look at it. And now Zelensky, again, looking at reality, Zelensky is realizing that there's nothing the West can do now to save him. They're out of everything. And the Russians are getting everything. And their only hope now is to find a negotiated settlement. I think that he believes the Chinese have more leverage over the Russians than they actually do. Because China has said, we're not here to dictate outcomes. So China's not going to put pressure on Russia. But what China will do, I believe, is promise Zelensky that the best he can hope for is to rebuild what he retains, meaning the territories that he's lost, he's not going to get back. But if you expect Europe and the United States to rebuild your destroyed nation, you are waiting in vain. They've already put $200 billion into you. They're not going to put any more. When this war is done, they're done. So China is your only savior. And I think what the Chinese are saying is bring an end to this conflict on terms that Russia will accept, and we will work to rebuild your country. We will work with you to rebuild your country. But if you don't make peace on terms that Russia can accept, you'll be left to your own devices. And it's going to take a little bit of time for this to percolate with Zelensky, but ultimately that's his only viable option out. And again, I know there's some people out there that get frustrated because China's doing this, China's doing that, but they're only able to do it because there's no competitor. Where's American diplomacy? All we bring to the table is war, 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 war. China's coming in and saying, no, look, the best thing is for us to have economic relations. We mutually benefit. We both get, growing economies. Peace is breaking out all over. And enough people in the world are just tired of decade after decade after decade of war. We in America don't know war. We think we know war, but we don't know war. We live in a wonderfully prosperous nation that's been free of the death and destruction that large-scale war brings. The rest of the world, however, they know war firsthand, and they're exhausted by it. And because America's not providing that alternative, that diplomatic solution, all we offer is more war. China is able to come in and look what they're doing. I mean, how can you argue against, let's remove the Chinese accent from it. How can you argue against peace? You can't.
Yeah, that there's been this vacuum created, and I don't know, I don't want to become political. I know that you have your own thoughts or whatever, but it does seem that the Biden administration doesn't want to do diplomacy, or maybe they're not good at it. I don't know, but America used to be known for being good diplomats. And now it's like they just hang up the phone. They don't want the communication happening.
Nixon went to China. Trump went to North Korea. But where's Biden going? And again, I'm not going to get political. I'll respect that. I'm not here to score political points, but where we need, and I think the problem here is that you know the world has changed since Richard Nixon went to China. The world has even changed since Donald Trump went to um, North Korea. We're in a situation right now where the United States is in retrograde. The American empire is falling down. The dollar is not strong. People are dumping the dollar, going for other alternative currencies. There's this BRICS economic forum that's standing up and challenging the G7. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is challenging the transatlantic relationship between the United States and Europe. And the Biden administration seems to be locked in the past. If you read their foreign policies, they talk about the importance of sustaining the rules-based international order, which of course is something that was created in the aftermath of the Second World War. But the war's been over for 8 decades now. The world is changing, and the Biden administration seems to be slow about adapting to new realities. The best thing you can do is get ahead of this change and seek to impose your vision, your face, your fingerprints on whatever this change is going to be. But we're not doing that. We're back here trying to slow down the change. The Chinese are the ones getting ahead of it, putting their fingerprint on everything.
Yeah. Well, maybe the White House doesn't want Biden going out and talking to people. I mean, they barely even let the press ask him questions here in the United States. So thank you so much, Scott. This has been a great discussion. I'm going to put your website, scottritterextra.com, where they can learn about you, the material you're putting out, a documentary that you're raising money for, and they can be kept in the loop on all things Scott Ritter. Thank you so much for coming on today's show.
Thank you very much for having me.